Yep, this is Bench Gamer here. So I have already finished watching the gameplay trailer for Final Fantasy XVI. If you don't know what that is, Final Fantasy XVI is the next mainline entry into the Final Fantasy franchise. It's not like an MMO like Final Fantasy XIV. I guess Final Fantasy requires a bit of exposition now because, most people born after the 2000s probably know it mainly as like Final Fantasy XIV, the MMO. That's the game that Final Fantasy is most known for now after Square Enix kind of fucked up how the game has been developed after since 12. So I grew up with this franchise. It was one of the main games that shaped how I thought about JRPGs and just RPG games in general. So I have a quite fond memories of it. I played Final Fantasy VII, even though I never finished it. I played 10, 10-2. Actually, I think I played 10-2 before I played 10. But Final Fantasy X-2 is like one of my favorite JRPGs of all time. Probably like my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time. I know that's kind of controversial, but Final Fantasy X-2 had one of like the best combat systems ever for a turn-based game. Final Fantasy 12, I also played that for a very long time, but I never finished it. But even though I didn't finish 7 or 12, these games were part of the reason why I like anime and JRPG style games in the first place. And I don't really get the same feeling from Final Fantasy 16. Final Fantasy 13 was probably the last time I was really amazed by the graphics of the game. I think Final Fantasy 16 what is like an aesthetically very accomplished game. It looks amazing, but there are a lot of good-looking games all the time now. The combat, the action, the kaiju-esque fights that you're going to see in this trailer, they all look amazing. They all look very cinematic. But I just feel like I've already seen this before in God of War. I've already seen this before in Devil May Cry, which is probably intentional because Devil May Cry's gameplay designer was hired for Final Fantasy 16. So that's why you're seeing so many similarities to it in terms of the combat. And I like Devil May Cry, but it just doesn't feel that much like Final Fantasy. In some of the marketing, you even notice that they do a lot. They say a lot of things, like little things that try to set it apart from other Final Fantasy. For example, at one point, I think they said that you don't need to play previous Final Fantasy games to understand 16, which is true, but that is also true for practically all Final Fantasy games because they all have their own individual stories, except for sequels like 10-2 and 13-2 and 3. But even those games, you can probably jump into them, at least 10-2, without understanding the game. I played 10-2 first before 10, and I was definitely okay with it. So for them to say that this game you don't need to play any of the previous games, they probably have players who have already played Final Fantasy 14 in mind because that is mostly what Final Fantasy for like as a franchise is known for today. Nobody gives a fuck about 13 and its sequels. And a lot of players are too young to remember 12 or any of the games before that. They might have played Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it's just like a vague memory now. So I definitely understand what they're going for, but even so, it does make me a bit sad that they're trying to treat this game as like a reboot of Final Fantasy. I don't know if that comes across to you guys, but in one of the interviews that Yoshi P did, who is the story director for this game, I believe, as well as the guy who is directing Final Fantasy 14, he said that Japanese developers used to treat the word JRPG or the term JRPG as this pejorative, which I agree. It used to be a pejorative. Even now, there are people who treat games with anime style aesthetics or games made in Japan as something that is bad. You it's still a thing. Even games like Genshin Impact has responses similar to that. The people will just look at it and see that it's an anime style game and they'll hate it, or they'll hate the fact that it has anime style storytelling, whatever the fuck that means. And that used to be much more prevalent back in the day with games like Final Fantasy, with games like Dragon Quest. Back in my day, in the early 2000s to the late 2000s, the acceptance of anime style games and JRPGs was not anywhere near as ubiquitous as it is now. Even though I do still see it in some places, back when I think what game was it? With Elden Ring, yeah, with Elden Ring. I remember hearing one person say that they didn't like the aesthetic of Elden Ring because it was too Japanese. Like I have no idea what the fuck that means because Elden Ring just looks like a Western style aesthetic to me. Elden Ring obviously is heavily based on European mythology, Western mythology, and the combat, the mythos, all of it looks very Western to me. Except for maybe in some gameplay style elements that you could think of as Japanese, but aesthetically, what exactly is different about Elden Ring compared to Western games? I'm not talking about the UI. I'm talking about like the world building and the world itself. So if there's a difference, it's it's very inconspicuous to me. It's not like Genshin Impact or Tales of Arise, where the game literally looks like a real world anime Sword Art Online style world. Even games like Elden Ring have this kind of this negative bias towards them. So there were some times when I saw people say that JRPGs, what Yoshi P said about JRPGs is not true, but they definitely had a reason to treat it as a pejorative because it was used as a pejorative. I can attest to that as somebody who grew up in that era. So if you find that confusing as someone born after the 2000s, where anime was much more acceptable in high school, by the time of like the mid 2000s, 2010s, I think anime was just mainstream. If you liked anime or things that were made in Japan, it's not like you were a super special person. It was just accepted. But now that it's come to Final Fantasy 16, I do feel like they are trying very hard to make this seem like not a JRPG. They definitely want to set this game apart from the franchise that came before it because obviously that franchise has not evolved to a state that they find acceptable. By which I mean it's just not seen as a very good franchise anymore. When people say Final Fantasy, your first reaction to it is probably Final Fantasy 14. Nobody knows about the other games except for maybe Sephiroth and Cloud and Final Fantasy 7. That's the one exception to the rule. But other than that, the franchise as like a name is not treated with anywhere the kind of reverence that it once was. And this is the reboot that they are looking for to put the Final Fantasy name back in zeitgeist again, back into the conversation. And to do that, what they've done is essentially done the opposite of making a JRPG. They are entirely westernizing it. If you look at the way this game plays, it looks a lot like Devil May Cry. It looks a lot like God of War. The way the environment works with to me with its like empty spaces and the huge set pieces and the huge bosses, the combat, all of it looks just like God of War and Devil May Cry to me, which is a good thing because I like those games. But it doesn't make me think of the old Final Fantasy games. There's no more party control anymore. You're not controlling a party, you're just controlling one single character. And one of the most important things about JRPGs to me was being able to control multiple characters. And that's why I ultimately think of Genshin Impact as a JRPG, much more so that this game than this game is now. And with that said, Honkai Star Rail as well. Honkai Star Rail is actually more of what I thought older JRPGs would evolve into, but that doesn't seem to have been the case with Japan. Japan has evolved in two separate directions when it comes to game development. On one hand, you have this game, and I think Elden Ring and this game actually have more in common with each other than traditional JRPGs and this game. Traditional JRPGs still exist. Obviously, Square Enix is still making them. There's Octopath Traveler 2. There's Dragon Quest. There's Persona. There's probably going to be another Persona 5. Not Persona 5, but Persona game. Persona 6 is definitely getting made. So those games are probably going to remain turn-based games. And I think some games have even become turn-based games after they were action games to begin with. Like the Yakuza series, I think Yakuza 6, not Yakuza 6, but Yakuza Rise of a Dragon, I think that's what it's called, is a turn-based game. And the previous 5 games that were made in that series were action RPGs. So I don't know why they went in the opposite direction, but they did. And as a result, Japanese turn-based games are not in danger of dying. But there is not that much evolution in how turn-based games have work as a genre. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's like there's two different paths now. There's like the Nintendo path, there's the action RPG path that Final Fantasy is going with, and then there are just like older style JRPGs like Octopath Traveler. There's like Persona 5. and they are their own separate genre now. It's not just JRPGs, it's these games and these other games, and then there's Nintendo games. And I feel saddened by that. There's not as much cross pollination as I would have wanted. It should have been obvious for them to create a Genshin Impact. I've always wondered why Japan didn't make Genshin Impact, because it should have been obvious to them that an open world style game like Zelda would have gelled well with a game with a gacha genre, and then you could just put in a bunch of characters and sell them. But that never occurred to Japan. It it honestly kind of feels like they're not evolving. And when they do evolve, what they're taking away from is to create games that are more like the Western genre than just do their own thing. And that does sadden me. And that's why I just don't feel as excited about Final Fantasy 15 as I should. It feels like at this point, I think I'm more excited about Honkai Star Rail than 16. 16 looks fine. It looks like a very competent action style Devil May Cry slash God of War game. But I've already played Devil May Cry. I've already played God of War. They're excellent games. I don't need to play another one of those in Final Fantasy 16. So those are my thoughts on 16. Yes, JRPG was used as a pejorative in the past in some parts of the world, but it's not a pejorative now, and I'm not sure if the developers for the Final Fantasy franchise know that and why they're trying so hard to separate themselves from the Final Fantasy tradition. On the bright side, it's not like turn-based games are dying. There's Honkai Star Rail coming out. There's Octopath Traveler 2. I've heard that that's excellent. I might play it someday once it's on discount because I have absolutely no money right now. I have to save up for Street Fighter 6 and like this game, to be honest. And I think like Star Rail, I might spend a bit on it. I don't know yet at this point, depending on how it works out and how much of the game there is besides the turn-based gameplay. I might pull on that using the battle pass and the daily drop that they will definitely have. So that those are my plans for Star Rail right now. Depending on how the game plays, I never participated in any of the betas. I'm going into this completely blind, but I am more excited about that right now than this game. Again, not a quality judgment, not a judgment on the validity of its gameplay. It's just that personally for me, this game does not look like Final Fantasy 16. It looks like a mishmash of God of War and Devil May Cry. Anyways, this is Bench Gamer signing out. I hope you all enjoy this game when it comes out, and I hope I enjoy it as well. But like, there's no party, there's no turn-based gameplay. It doesn't even seem like there's that much story to it. It's very combat focused. Anyways, this is Bench Gamer signing out. I'll see you guys later. I'm still working on my video about how Genshin Impact is actually a live service masterpiece, and that's been a lot of hard work. So probably my next video. See you guys later. Bye bye.